Hello everyone, and thank you for providing me with an opportunity to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart. My name is Raivo Remmel. This is my Estonian name, which was shortened to Ray when I was in university. My parents were born in Estonia and escaped the Russian terror as refugees near the end of the Second World War. Similarly, my wife Anne-Marie's parents also escaped from Estonia at about the same time. Hence, Anne-Marie and I are Estonian Canadians, or Canadians with Estonian heritage. My objective is to give you a very brief history lesson about a part of World War II that you probably have heard very little about. I'll focus mainly on Estonia because it's my heritage, but the effects on other countries of Eastern Europe, such as Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, etc., are essentially similar or the same. No, don't worry, there's no test at the end. To make the history a little more real, I will describe how my parents and my in-laws escaped what was essentially Russian genocide. These are horrendous stories, unbelievable, but true. Several thousand others from Eastern Europe tell similar stories, and I have heard literally hundreds of them from other people. So, when someone mentions World War II, what do you think about? Well, D-Day, storming of the beaches in Normandy, bombing of London, the Holocaust, perhaps the liberation of the Netherlands. Who are the protagonists? Most people will say the Nazi Germans and the Allies. But then, who were the Allies? Well, I think we know Britain, Canada, and the US. But where does Russia fit in? I'll leave it to you to draw your own conclusions at the end of my presentation. When did the war take place? Technically, from September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945, a period of 6 years. In some places it started a little later or ended a little earlier, but essentially it was a 6-year war. Let's start by looking at what Europe looked like prior to the war. On the map, you can see from the north Finland, and below that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the 3 Baltic countries, Poland, and you can keep going further south and see Hungary and Romania. A little bit to the west is Germany, and of course the big bear, the Soviet Union, is to the east. Estonia, a very small country, a little smaller than Nova Scotia, with a population of approximately 1 million at the start of the war. At the end of the war, the population was about 750,000. This represents a loss of 25% of the population. So let's ask the next big question. Who or what started the war? In 1938, Germany rattled its sabers, and Britain, France, and Italy quickly acquiesced and allowed Germany to occupy Czechoslovakia. Naively, they thought this would avoid war. This was a weak and foolish response. But the war did not start here. Let's look at the bigger picture. Both Germany and Russia wanted to expand their territorial influence and control over Europe. They had the strongest militaries and the capabilities to do almost whatever they wanted. But they were also cautious and fearful of each other. The result was cooperation. A pact was signed in Moscow by the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. No, you don't have to remember the names. And was officially known as the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, This is commonly known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Its clauses provided a written guarantee of peace by each party towards the other, and a commitment that declared that neither government would ally itself to or aid an enemy of the other. In addition to the publicly announced stipulations of non-aggression, the treaty included a secret protocol which defined the borders of Germany and the Soviet Union and defined their spheres of influence across Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. You can see it portrayed on the map, but simplistically, Germany and Russia said to each other, "I'll take this, you can have that." The agreement was signed on August 23rd, 1939, and Germany invaded Poland a week later on September 1st. Britain and France retaliated and declared war 2 days later on September 3rd, and the war was on. 2 weeks later, on September the 17th, Russia invaded Poland from the other side, and Poland, caught in a vice, was crushed in less than a month. So, what happened to Estonia? Well, at the end of September in 1939, the Soviet Union forced all the Baltic countries to sign a pact of mutual assistance, and with the fate of Poland only too obvious, the Baltic countries agreed to the pressure, and the Soviet military bases were subsequently established within days in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Additionally, 25,000 Soviet soldiers were brought into Estonia and similar numbers into Latvia and Lithuania. In effect, the Baltic countries were now controlled by the Soviet Union. In April 1940, Germany invaded Western Europe, and in June, while the world attention was distracted in the West, the Soviet Union's forces occupied the Baltic countries totally. Fraudulent elections were held, and puppet pro-Soviet governments were installed. These immediately requested to join the Soviet Union. With annexation complete, the process of Russification or Sovietization began. It's probably more correct to call this Russian terror and genocide. Estonian youth and former members of the armed forces were conscripted into the Red Army. Land was confiscated. Enterprises were nationalized. A lot of anti-Soviet elements were cleansed. The focus was on politicians, teachers, successful business people, and anyone that might be in a position of potential opposition. Opposition was brutally repressed. Tens of thousands of people were either arrested, shot, or deported to Siberian gulags or work camps, where up to half of them died. These included all ages and all sexes, including grandparents, young mothers, young children, and even babies. By the summer of 1941, the pact between Germany and the Soviet Union had soured, and Germany invaded the Baltics with the goal of quickly moving east through Estonia to capture the Russian city of Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg. Within months, Germany conquered Estonia and established a new government under German military command. Although the Germans had no intention of restoring Estonian independence, they were still viewed as liberators. The Germans lacked the brutality of the Russians, but they still practiced political repression and racial cleansing of Jews and others who were considered not Aryan enough or who may have been cooperating with the Soviets during their period of occupation. For 2 years, things were somewhat stagnant, but in late 1943 and the beginning of 1944, the German army stalled before Leningrad. Estonian youth were now conscripted into the German army for support. There were brothers, where one was in the Red Army and the other in the German army, both conscripted against their will. In the beginning of 1944, the Red Army began pushing the Germans back, and by February, the front was at the Estonian border. The fighting was intense, but the Germans and the newly conscripted Estonians held firm. The Russians became frustrated and showed their true colors the night of March the 9th by carpet bombing Tallinn, the capital city of Estonia. They targeted residential areas and cultural institutions such as the theater, the archive, and churches. 1/3 of the city was leveled, with over 20,000 individuals left homeless and freezing in the cold weather of early March. No military targets were targeted. Today, this would be called a war crime. They repeated this on 2 other large towns. But the Estonian front continued to hold. The Russians changed their strategy, and by late summer, the Russians were able to beat the Germans in Latvia. This allowed the Germans to attack Estonia from the south as well as from the east. This two-pronged attack was too much. Soon, the end was in sight. The Germans began a retreat. By September 22nd, the Soviets captured Tallinn and the Germans were gone. The rest of the war is essentially immaterial to Estonia. However, within a 3 to 4 week period prior to the fall of Tallinn, 100,000 Estonians had fled by whatever means they had. No one wanted another dose of Soviet repression and genocide. These included the stories of escape by my parents and my in-laws that I am going to recount next. First, let me introduce my mother. At the start of the war, she was in her late teens and attending a private girls' school, living in residence a considerable distance from her home, which was a farm near the Russian border in northern Estonia. When Russians came in the first time, they initially took the school for their army base and sent the girls home. After the formal annexation of Estonia, the school was reopened with changes. Everyone had to learn Russian, singing Estonian songs was forbidden, radios were confiscated, and all the good books were taken away and burned. Further, everyone had to write telegrams regularly praising Stalin. When the Germans took over, the school was converted into a field hospital. While not ideal, life was tolerable. When the tide of war turned in 1944, my mother, having graduated by this time, was living at home, close to the Russian border. Together with a girlfriend from school and her mother, they decided to get out before the Russians took that option away. My mother's older brother and his wife had already fled to Finland. But my mother's younger sister and parents stayed behind to look after the farm animals. My mother's group was able to get on the last train to Tallinn. It was full of German soldiers retreating, but a flat car was added for refugees. During the train ride, a Russian airplane hit the train with strafing fire, but luckily my mother's group did not get hit. In Tallinn, they managed to get onto the smaller of the last 2 ships still taking passengers from the harbor. The bigger ship, The hospital ship Moiro left, but my mother's ship, the RO-22, was delayed as it waited for the last group of German soldiers. They finally left in the late evening as another Russian bombing raid was starting on the city. As they left, they could see Tallinn burning. They considered themselves fortunate not to have been bombed. At about 7 o'clock the next morning, there was a loud blast and violent shaking. A Russian airplane had dropped a torpedo, and the stern of the ship was hit. The hull was filling with water, and the bow was rising fast. The ship was almost lost. However, the captain commanded all who were able to go to the bow to try to lever the ship back to horizontal, while airtight compartments were sealed below deck. Fortunately, the weather turned ugly, and a storm kept the Russian aircraft from coming back. A normal 12 to 14-hour journey took 3 days. Eventually, they docked in Göttenhofen, near what today is Gdansk, Poland. There they learned that the bigger ship that had departed the Tallinn harbor, the Moiro, a couple of hours before them, had also been torpedoed and had sunk, taking most of the people on board with her. The actual number of lives lost is not exactly known, but it is accepted as the largest naval tragedy in history, worse than the Titanic. From there, they took a train to Berlin with the goal of going to a small town in central Germany, away from the fighting. They spent a night in a Berlin bomb shelter during the nightly raid, and they waited for the connecting train south the next day. Finally, they made it to the small destination town and settled in. However, when the war ended the next summer, they were disappointed that the Allies had agreed to give that part of Germany, now known as East Germany, to the Russians, and they were on the run again. A German noble gave them an old horse and a wagon to traverse the hills and to get into the British zone. From there, they hitched a ride with the American forces heading further west to a refugee camp in Göttingen. There she met my dad. Sometime later, together they transferred to another refugee camp, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the Russians, who they hated and distrusted. In 1947, they were married, and later that same year, Britain accepted them as refugees. They moved to Leicester, England, my birthplace. The future was not promising in England, so we lived very frugally and saved to come to Canada. 3 years in refugee camps, 3 years saving money in England, and finally, Canada became our home just a few days shy of my 3rd birthday. My father's story is somewhat abbreviated. He was essentially a teenaged orphan living in Tallinn. His mother had died when he was an infant, and his father had remarried and moved to a distant city. Grandmother had raised him. My dad was quite independent and resourceful. I don't know much about his escape, as he hated to talk about it and really tried to put it out of his mind. But the story is that he and a friend stole a German army truck and several jerry cans of gasoline and drove south through Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland to Germany. I suspect that this story is somewhat embellished, but that is the story that I've heard. No doubt they just managed to take advantage of the German retreat. My dad knew how to drive truck, so he was no doubt very useful to the retreating Germans. Regardless, he lived better than some others in the refugee camps because he had an excellent memory and was very analytical. This enabled him to earn cigarettes, the currency of the camps, by playing cards and chess. Being a truck driver for the United Nations Refugee Relief Program also gave him access to goods that he could barter from the German country folk. The rest of the story has already been covered under my mum's situation. So, a quick summary. My mother was able to get on the last train to Tallinn. She endured strafing fire on the train, avoided getting bombed in Tallinn, managed to get on the last evacuation ship to Poland, which was torpedoed but survived. She lived through bombing in Berlin and spent 3 years in refugee camps in Germany. My dad, with a German army truck out of Tallinn to Germany, escaped. Also 3 years in refugee camps where my mom and dad got married, followed by 3 years in England, and finally a happy new life in Canada. They obviously spoke Estonian, but they also had to learn German, Russian, and eventually English, which they managed to do. And now let me recount the story of Anne-Marie's parents. They lived in a fishing town and were married during the war. Although they didn't directly feel the Russian brutality, they saw enough not to want to risk it again. And when their passports were finally stamped Turkestan, a city in Kazakhstan, the message was clear: get out! In late August, the decision was made to leave everything behind and escape to Sweden with a group of friends and relatives. By devious means, Anne-Marie's father and older brother were able to avoid the coastal patrols and take their little fishing boat with 40 liters of spare fuel to a little fishing village 15 or 20 kilometers down the coast. This is where Anne-Marie's aunt or mother's sister lived with her family and relatives. They were able to get the other women and children from the town to the village as well. There is a small uninhabited island a little way offshore, and this is where they hid the boat, removing the carburetor to keep the boat from being stolen. The fuel drum was weighted down and hidden underwater. In the general desperation of everyone trying to flee, nothing was safe. The coastal patrols were very vigilant and had to be avoided as well. Before we proceed with the story, let me describe the boat to you. It was owned by Anne-Marie's father's older brother. It was well built of wood, but only 24 feet long, 6 feet wide, and open. The motor was a single cylinder inboard that had several years of wear and tear on it. A canvas tarp was nailed to the bow and covered most of the boat, leaving the last 8 feet totally uncovered. And this is what they were going to cross the Baltic Sea in September, a typically stormy month. The departure date was selected to coincide with a shore patrol birthday party. When they went over to the small island, 2 other similar boats had arrived as part of their escape plan. The group decided to travel together and to tie the boats to one another so that they would not become separated and could also support each other if necessary. On Anne-Marie's parents' boat, there were 11 people. Obviously Anne-Marie's parents, the uncle with his wife and 2 children, aged 2 and 3, and 5 others. They departed at 2 p.m. on August 31st, 1944. The timing was planned to allow them to pass the Big Island Peninsula in the darkness, as the German sentries were very active on the island. At about midnight, they were out on the open water and a storm came up. To make matters worse, the fuel from the drum that had been hidden underwater was wet. During the storm, the engine had to be stopped and the carburetor dried frequently. With the wind rising and the high waves, the ropes holding the boats together snapped. They were unable to retie them despite effort. On the second day, one of the other boats capsized behind them. The waves were so high that they had terrible difficulty turning around to help. They attempted everything, including throwing ropes, but to no avail. Of course, life jackets were unheard of at that time. Everyone drowned. This included Anne-Marie's grandmother, her mother's sister with her husband and 2 children, the sister's 2 brothers-in-law and their families, the wife and daughter of one of the men on Anne-Marie's parents' boat even, and others. The third boat decided to turn back, but obviously also capsized, as they were never seen or heard from again. In all, 32 individuals drowned. In fighting the wind and waves, the additional fear was that they would run out of fuel. The storm was fierce. The boat rode up one wave and then fell through the air into the next trough. Waves were 20 to 30 feet high. Water came into the boat constantly and the bailing was nonstop. Under the tarp, the children and women were rolling and shivering in the cold water. It is amazing that they did not get pneumonia or worse. Then the tarp tore off at the bow. Anne-Marie's dad tied a rope around his waist, the other end held by his brother, and crawled along the edge to nail it back down again. Stubbornness and determination kept them going, but they were losing ground. As the storm pushed them back past the large peninsula, where there are numerous shallows and a 10 to 15 kilometer wide German minefield, they had difficulty in navigating a safe passage, and only by luck made a last-minute course correction to avoid disaster. All this in a storm, and they really had no idea where they really were. As they were now turned around and headed back eastward, the huge waves with massive whitecaps were flooding the boat. "Keep bailing." The next day, the engine finally failed, and Anne-Marie's uncle spent the whole morning trying to fix the engine. They had more difficulty, but I think I've described enough of the horrendous and frightening picture. They eventually made it to the island of Gihno, having spent 55 hours on the cruel Baltic Sea, losing 32 family members and friends, and they were now hiding on an island only an hour or 2 from where they started. This island had also suffered severe damage from the storm. There were numerous down and uprooted trees. But they were not deterred. The fear of the Soviets was stronger than the losses suffered so far. They rested, fixed the boat, managed to acquire more fuel, and purchased a compass, preparing to depart again. I just can't imagine them leaving the first time without a compass, but that is in fact what they did. A week later, they left with 12 people on board. Slight change of personnel. This time, the sea was rough, but not as bad as the first time. After leaving the island, they hit a rock on a sandbar, damaging the propeller, and bending the shaft. Uncle filed down the prop to keep it functioning, but the engine was now running rough as the prop was out of balance. There was nothing further to be done. On the second afternoon, a German naval convoy came by, and they were scrutinized by binoculars on the vessels. They quickly changed course, going into shallower water where the German ships could not go. The typical German action in this type of situation was well known. They would pick up and arrest the people and sink their boats. Whether the evasive maneuver was enough of a deterrent or whether the captain had more critical priorities is unknown, but they escaped another potential disaster. The rest of the journey was reasonably uneventful until near the end. The continuous shaking of the engine was making the bolts on the engine vibrate loose. These were constantly tightened, but eventually the threads were stripped and a bolt sheared. The result was engine failure. Around midnight, they saw the lights on the island of Gotland off the coast of Sweden. This energized the demoralized crew. They fashioned a sail out of the tarp and started to make reasonable progress. But then the wind turned offshore and they were being pushed back out to sea by the wind, waves, and current. The only option was to start rowing. They rowed in shifts throughout the night. They made no progress, but did not lose ground either. By morning, all the men's hands were raw and bloody, and they were still a few kilometers from shore and by now thoroughly exhausted. Fortunately, the lighthouse keeper was going to the lighthouse to turn out the light when he spotted the small boat offshore and sent a rescue boat to bring them in. The women, in stereotypical fashion, started cleaning up the boat and threw all the debris and waste overboard. They had brought a whole suitcase of cigarettes with them, as this was the best currency during the war for barter. Unfortunately, these were all soaked and useless. Overboard. 10 hours of hell, but they were on dry ground. They were taken to a small transition camp, were able to clean themselves in a sauna, and were given new and dry clothing. Uncle had brought along a tin of ham and 4 bottles of vodka. These were gone by nightfall, and they were all very drunk, but happy. I should add that Anne-Marie's mother was pregnant with Anne-Marie's brother at this time, and he was born in Sweden some months later. In Sweden, initially they were in a temporary camp for 3 days. One would think this would be a comparative luxury, but no. The camp was infested with bed bugs, and getting a good night's sleep was almost impossible. The next camp was their home for 5 months. It was a work camp from which they were sent to work building roads daily. After the camp, Anne-Marie's father worked in a leather tannery for 3 years, a dirty and wet environment with exposure to all kinds of unpleasant chemicals. They spent another 4 years in another small town working in a textile factory. The only joy here was the birth of their daughter, Anne-Marie. However, Sweden was not the wonderful safe place it has been perceived to be. The Russians are paranoid of any opposition. Their great fear is that the Estonians that escaped would form a vocal opposition and draw unwanted attention on the Russians. They wanted to destroy the Estonian diaspora, as well as the Estonian people, language, and culture left in Estonia. They started enticing people to return to their homeland with all kinds of wild promises. A few went back and were never seen or heard from again. When this tactic failed to bring the desired results, the Russians applied intense diplomatic pressure on Sweden to repatriate some of the Baltic people. Making matters worse, Sweden did not really want these refugees anyway, as it was an economic and social burden for them. Sweden was also not a signatory to the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, which protected the human rights of the refugees. However, fortunately, Sweden was also well aware of the fate awaiting anyone who did return to their homeland. In this uncertain and fearful political environment, many former refugees started seeking a new and safer home. For Anne Marie's family, this was Canada. They were accepted as immigrants and bought passage on a ship. Anne Marie has always been delighted with Canada for throwing a huge party with fireworks to welcome them upon their arrival. Of course, their ship docked in Montreal on Canada Day. Let me summarize their epic journey. These devious departure from their hometown to get to a little fishing village. 2 unbelievable attempts to cross the Baltic Sea. The painful loss of 32 family and friends. Establishing life in Sweden, learning the difficult language, only to leave again and establish a new life in Canada, again learning a new strange language. Now that you have heard all the stories, who won the war? What do you think? Well, Western Europe returned to their pre-war status quo condition, more or less. Britain, Canada, and the US, the same. Of course, Britain had been bombed and was hurting, but they had their land and their independence. Germany was divided, but still Germany. But obviously, they're a bit of a loser. Finland lost a little bit of territory, the southwest corner called Karelia. And then there's the Baltic countries in Eastern Europe. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all lost their independence and were the biggest losers of all. The Soviet Union. They were obviously the huge winner. They acquired massive territory. Only after the financial collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 were the Baltic countries able to reclaim and reestablish their independence in 1991. And even then it took another 2 years before they were able to have the Russian troops totally leave their soil. Our parents and the other Estonian refugees came to this country with nothing and without language skills. What have they accomplished? They built an Estonian community in the Toronto area, established churches, a heritage language school, choirs, scouts and guides, folk dance groups, summer camps, the Estonian House Community Center, and much more. Their language and culture are alive and thriving. Oh yeah, by accident, Anne Marie and I met at a fraternity party and were soon thereafter married. We have raised our sons in the Estonian culture and they speak Estonian fluently, as does a granddaughter. Despite attempted genocide by the Soviets, coming within a hair of being killed in the war, having to resettle into new countries, learn new languages, and establish new careers. They achieved very good lives, raised happy families, and ensured that their children obtained university educations, all while supporting and sustaining their language and culture. God, give me the strength to follow in their footsteps. Thank you.